What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Planeswalker project, where our goal is to help you dive into the Commander format and find the deck that's right for you. With so many options, building your Commander deck can be a daunting task. That's why we're here to help you hone your craft. So sit back, relax, and let's get to work. Today's deck is a Patron request to build a Reanimator deck that isn't the typical run-of-the-mill Marin or Alicia, but still has the ability to go big and win. After trying to find several other options, I find that Gyrus, Waker of Corpses, is by far my favorite. Gyrus is a 0/0 Hydra that costs a black, a red, and a green, as well as an optional X. Gyrus enters the battlefield with +1/+1 counters on it equal to the amount of mana spent to cast it. So at its absolute least, Gyrus will enter the battlefield with 3 counters on it, should you choose not to spend any mana on the X cost. As you recast Gyrus or gain access to the mana to sink a ton into the X cost, Gyrus can become extremely powerful. Gyrus also has another ability that will directly impact our deck strategy. Whenever it attacks, you can exile a target creature from your graveyard that has less power than Gyrus. If you do, you can then create a token that's a copy of that exiled card that enters the battlefield tapped and attacking. At the end of combat, you exile the token. The main strategy of this deck aims to put creatures on the field and get whatever value out of them we can. Then, after they die and go to the graveyard, Gyrus and several other cards with similar abilities can return their corpses to the battlefield to gain additional value. Many of our creatures can also be cheated into play by the various ways of filling up our graveyard. As a Reanimator deck, we have the ability to utilize our graveyard as an extension of our hand, and this will be one of our deck's greatest strengths. This is going to be a more aggro take on Reanimator, as our commander's ability triggers when it's declared as an attacker, so we'll want to hit the ground running as quick as we can. So with that in mind, let's begin with the ramp package and mana fixing. Sakura Tribe Elder can be sacrificed to pull a basic land from our library onto the battlefield tapped. Something to keep in mind with this build is that many of the abilities, such as the Elder here, can be utilized multiple times if we choose to return it to the battlefield after being sent to the graveyard. Sad Boy here is a double value, getting us a basic land into play tapped upon it entering the battlefield, and then giving us a card draw when it dies. Keep in mind, we can reanimate this to get multiple instances of these abilities. Wood Elves is a green commander staple and a good card to use as a revival target, as it lets us search for a forest card to put onto the battlefield. In this deck, we can go for non-basic lands that have the forest land type. Chromatic Lantern is a mana rock that can tap for any color and will also make it so your lands tap for any color as well. Golgari, Gruul, and Rakdos Signets let you trade 1 mana of any color for the 2 colored mana of the respective guild. Phyrexian Altar lets you sack a creature for a mana of any color. This is especially good because it helps you ramp your mana and build up your graveyard. Farseek lets you grab a mountain or swamp card and put it into play tapped. These can be non-basic lands as long as they have the appropriate land type. Nature's Lore lets you put a forest card into play, and Skyshroud Cling gets you 2 forest cards. And just as with Farseek, they can be non-basic as long as they have the appropriate land type. Satyr Wayfinder digs 4 deep on the top of our library for a land card, and then pitches the rest to the graveyard. We want to make sure that we have plenty of ways to fill up our graveyard with creatures to revive later on, and this is a great way to do so. Bloodsport Thrinax lets you sack any number of creatures, and for each one, Thrinax enters play with an additional 1/1 counter on it. After that, while Thrinax is in play, each other creature you control enters the battlefield with 1/1 counters on it equal to the number of counters on Bloodsport Thrinax, letting your cards come in at a much bigger size than normal. This also impacts our commander, as it'll let Gyrus come in as a much bigger threat. And remember, the bigger Gyrus is, the bigger the creatures he can revive. Combustible Gearhak gives target opponent the option to let you draw 3 cards. If they choose not to do so, you mill 3, and then they take damage equal to the combined mana cost of the cards you milled. Both abilities are incredibly valuable to our deck, as we either get card draw or we burn an opponent and fill our graveyard. Corpse Connoisseur lets you send a creature from your library to your graveyard, and it has an earth, so you can use it a couple times. Disciple of Bolas lets you sacrifice another creature for X life gain and card draw based on that creature's power. Fauna Shaman lets you pay a green and pitch a creature from your hand to tutor for a creature to add to your hand. This can be used to put something huge in the graveyard or to search for something you need at that moment. Playcrafter forces each player to either discard a card or sack a planeswalker or a creature. Stitcher Supplier mills you 3 whenever it enters play or dies, giving you a total of 6 cards added to your graveyard. Underrealm Lich gives you the option, whenever you would draw a card, to look at the top 3 cards of your library, choose 1 to keep in your hand, and send the other 2 to the graveyard. Since this deck can utilize the graveyard so easily, it might as well just let you draw 3 cards whenever you would draw a card. Greater Good lets you sacrifice a creature to draw cards equal to the sacked creature's power, and then you discard 3 cards. Again, we're working up the numbers of our graveyard while getting card draw. Tortured Existence is a 1-drop that lets us discard a creature card to return a creature card from our graveyard to our hand. Altar of Dementia lets you sacrifice a creature to mill a player equal to the power of the sacrificed creature. This can be used to burn out an opponent's library or to fill our own with treasures to dig up later. Birthing Pod is a brutal combo enabler in most decks. In this deck, we can use it to sacrifice our creatures to build them into a larger creature. This is another vicious way to cheat mana costs, as not only are we getting bigger bodies into play for much less mana, but those cards that are now in the graveyard can be recycled later on. Buried Alive lets you ditch 3 cards to the graveyard. While this card is rather narrow in its scope, it is incredibly valuable for this deck's strategy. Life from the Loam is an interesting card that can let you get 3 lands from your graveyard back to your hand. This is good to bring back cards that might have been milled, but the real value is in the Dredge 3. Instead of drawing a card, you can mill 3 and return the Life from the Loam from your graveyard back to your hand. So now that we've talked about all the cards that put other cards into the graveyard, let's talk about the cards that take other cards out of the graveyard. To start with, we have Eternal Witness, who lets us grab any card from the graveyard and return it to our hand. Feldon of the Third Path lets you make a token copy of a creature in your graveyard, makes it into an artifact as well as its other types, gives it haste, and then it's sacrificed at the next end step. This can be used offensively to get extra bodies in play to attack while not affecting the original in the graveyard. It can also be used defensively to make an emergency blocker. You'll want to take note of which of these Reanimator cards will use the actual card in the graveyard, or in the case of Feldon, making a copy of the original. With the numerous Reanimator outlets in this deck, we can actually create several copies of some of our cards. Phyrexian Delver brings target creature from your graveyard back to the battlefield. You lose life equal to its converted mana cost. This is an instance of the actual card being impacted in the graveyard, unlike with Feldon's ability. Sepulchral Primordial doesn't revive your creatures, but it lets you take creatures from each of your opponent's graves. Animate Dead lets you bring back a creature from the graveyard, but saps it of 1 power point. But for 2 mana, it's one of our cheapest Reanimator spells. Whip of Erebos gives your board lifelink, a useful ability, but it also lets you return a creature from your graveyard to the field. That creature gains haste, and is exiled if it leaves the battlefield before the beginning of the next end step, when it's exiled anyway. You can only use this ability at sorcery speed. Beacon of Unrest brings back an artifact or creature, then shuffles back into the library to be used again later. I like this recurring reanimation ability, and its ability to be used on artifacts and creatures from any graveyard make it incredibly versatile. We have a pair of creatures in this deck, Anger and Brawn, that give keyword abilities while they're in our graveyard, and we control a mountain or a forest respectively. Anger gives haste to our creatures, and Brawn gives trample. Both of these work best while they're in our graveyard, and so these are rarely targets for any of our Reanimator abilities. The final section of our spell package is going to be the value creatures that don't quite fit into the other categories, but offer abilities that make them invaluable for this deck. Acidic Slime is a universal removal for pesky cards. When it hits play, you can destroy either a land, enchantment, or artifact. It has Death Touch as well, so it's great protection against creatures. Whenever Avenger of Zendikar hits the field, we get a 0/1 plant token for each land we control. If we choose to reanimate him, we can get a ton of plant tokens to defend us. Bane of Progress destroys all artifacts and enchantments when it hits play, and then it gets a 1/1 counter on it for each card destroyed this way. The Bane of Progress is a great threat that can hit play as an immense beast. Craterhoof Behemoth is pretty much the iconic green finisher, giving our creatures trample and +X based on the number of creatures we control. So if ever this hits play, it's likely going to be game over for the opponents. Hornet Queen comes with 4 1/1 flying Death Touch insect creatures. These can be effective blockers, as rarely will opponents want to swing into a 1/1 Death Touch token. If we can reanimate her several times, we can amass a ton of tokens. Master of Cruelties is, well, cruel. It's a 1/4 with First Strike and Death Touch, so blocking it is very ineffective. Whenever it isn't blocked, however, instead of dealing damage, it makes the attacked player's life total 1. The problem is, normally, the Masters of Cruelties can only attack alone. This only applies to the Declare Attacker step, but if this card is brought into play tapped and attacking with something like Gyrus' ability, this is done after the Declare Attacker step, so the attack can take place with multiple other creatures. This can be fatal to opponents if they cannot block. Noxious Gearhak is a powerful creature with menace and has creature removal. If you destroy a creature with the Gearhak, you gain life equal to its toughness. I like to surprise cheat this in with Feldon at instant speed to destroy an attacker. It's like Swords to Plowshares, only kind of better. Xenagos, God of Rebels, is a neat little tech for this deck. When you have this god in play, you can double a creature's power and toughness until the end of turn at the beginning of combat, so targeting Gyrus, you can get a greater range for his ability. The strategy with Gyrus should be pretty clear. We throw out our creatures, many of which offer a good amount of initial value, we get ramp, removal, and other abilities, but once they die, we can use Gyrus later on to bring them back. We can use other abilities like Feldon to bring them back multiple times, as Gyrus does exile the original card, rendering it unusable after that. For this reason, we'll want to hit hard and fast so we can end the game quickly. Otherwise, our grave fodder might run low before we can finish out the game. However, we do run a single card that can make some of these Reanimator abilities even more powerful. It's called Sundial of the Infinite, and for 1 mana, we can end the turn while it's our turn. When you do this, the turn immediately ends. So for abilities such as Gyrus, Feldon, and others whose abilities end at the end of turn, we pass by the timing of those triggers. So rather than losing our reanimated creatures at the end of our turn, we can retain those creatures. With Gyrus in particular, since his ability exiles the revived token at the end of combat, we would use the Sundial immediately after damage is dealt, so the turn is ended just as combat is about to end. This is a bit more of an advanced strategy that requires you have an understanding of the individual phases and steps of each turn. Nevertheless, the Sundial is an incredibly valuable card for this deck to really go over the top. So now that we've covered the spells and tricks this deck has to offer, I want to talk about the mana base. There are many ways you can go about doing this, from the budget builds to the optimized mana bases. While I personally don't like the idea of original dual lands in this kind of deck, we do have some tuning done to this mana base. The shock lands are the most important kind of dual lands we can run here. Blood Crypt, Overgrown Tomb, and Stomping Grounds each feature the basic land types of Swamp, Forest, and Mountain, making them candid targets for our mana ramp. The check lands, Dragonskull Summit, Rootbound Crag, and Woodland Cemetery are next, coming into play untapped so long as you control one of the 2 land types. Luxury Suite and Spire Garden come in untapped as long as you have 2 or more opponents. Since Commander is a multiplayer format, you'll usually always have 2 or more opponents. The filter lands, Graven Cairns and Twilight Mire, are great to fix our mana with our lands. Forge of Heroes is specifically for Gyrus, giving it an additional 1/1 counter on it if it entered the battlefield this turn. Oran Reef the Vastwood gives every green creature that entered the battlefield this turn a counter. The only land that ever has to enter our battlefield tapped is Savage Lands, which provides us with 1 mana of any of our deck's colors. We also have the Pain lands Karplusan Forest, Llanowar Waste, and Sulphurous Springs, which give us colorless mana, but for 1 life they can give us 1 of 2 colored mana. Finally, Orbur comes in to make everything part swamp, giving us additional mana fixin', and even gives our utility lands the ability to tap for black. Well, that's gonna wrap up this video. Special shout out and thanks to Sean from Family Fun and Hobbies of New Jersey for his help in the groundwork for this deck. And another thanks to the patron that requested this video. Let's discuss this deck further in the comments section below. Who's your favorite commander? Let us know and maybe you'll see them in an upcoming video. You can support this channel by subscribing and ringing that bell icon, liking and sharing our videos, or by helping out our Patreon. You can also grab yourself a sweet Planeswalker Project playmat over at Inked Gaming. Really appreciate your time hanging out with us discussing this week's deck. You all rock, and as always, I'll catch you guys, gals, and NB pals next time.